Hello and welcome to A Novel Idea, the show where we interview authors. My name is Noelle Boc. I am your host, and welcome to Todd Balf.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. So you just came out with a book
Yes.
called Three Kings, which is, I like the subtitle, Race, Class, and the Barrier-Breaking Rivals Who Launched the Modern Olympic Age.
It's a lot, right?
It's a lot. It is definitely a mouthful to say. So I was, just to start off, like, what got you started in writing this book?
Yeah, I don't think I was on anybody's bingo card to be writing about swimming in the Olympics in 1920, but it wasn't, even though I grew up in Rockport and around water, I really didn't have anything to do with swimming and kind of avoided it most of the time. And but my relationship kind of changed. I got sick. I had an operation for cancer, and out of that operation, I was partially paralyzed, and so, long story short, I'd spent a lot of years trying to walk, and then right around COVID, about 3 years ago, somebody said, like, why don't you try swimming? And I'm like, well, I don't really swim, especially now, and. But they said, and so I got in the pool, and I had a special kind of flotation wetsuit, and I could swim, and it felt really liberating and great, and all of a sudden I was interested about everything about swimming, and started reading deeply, and one of the stories that I came across, it was really just a couple paragraphs, was about 1920s and the race in Paris between three swimmers, Duke Kahanamoku, who was Hawaiian, Johnny Weissmuller, who was from Chicago, and Katsuo Takaish, who was from Japan. And I just thought, what just a really interesting cast of characters, and so really I really started to look really heavily into their backgrounds and their origins, and it just got richer and richer, and I just said, this really is a book.
And it really is. I mean, I actually finished it this week, so it's very fresh.
That's great.
In my brain, and of course, right now we happen to be watching the Paris Olympics,
right?
And one of the centerpieces of the book is the Paris Olympics from 1924. So we have that perfect storm of the 100-year anniversary, which is fantastic. To and swimming has always been one of my favorite sports to watch in the Olympics, because I always feel like it's very exciting and that anything could potentially happen. You get those people who are like the Katie Ledeckis, right, who are gonna smash most of the time. But sometimes they fail, and new people suddenly surge up and become something new.
It's very appealing sport to watch, I think.
And most of the time, except you have like the 1,500 meters, which seems to go on forever. But usually they're very fast. So you're watching these things that happen very, very quickly.
Right.
So I happened to already know about Duke.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because I was a children's librarian for many, many years, and children's authors love to write biographies about, little-known people.
Right, yeah.
So, there happens to be a picture book biography about him, so I did know, but it was actually focusing more on his surfing, than anything else. So I was really interested to see this backstory that you had about him and with swimming. And then I really love about this piece is that, where you really start talking about, and this is, I didn't know this, and this is still the early days of the Olympics too, right? Like that, so because 1896 is when we got the modern age of the Olympics.
That's right.
So it's really not that old when you're writing about this book. And I didn't realize how, I should have, I guess, how super white and privileged, I guess, that it was, right? That you're talking about people have money, people have Ivy League educations, they're pulling from the specific place.
Right.
And so talk a little bit about, so I thought it was very interesting, talk a little bit about how we managed to get a Kahanamoku in the mix.
Yeah, well, I think
and a Jim Thorpe, too, right?
Yeah, I think that Kahanamoku was really, it really is interesting because there was so little opportunity for anybody of color or even, lower class that could get involved in the Olympics. And, I think that on one hand, he was kind of fortunate in that in 1912 he was entered into a race by a kind of a patron of sorts who saw his potential, and started a AAU chapter, which was for the Olympic organizing group basically for the U.S. and had a race in Hawaii, and he broke the record by 4 seconds, the national and world record. And everyone's like, well, that couldn't be true, in part because this is territorial, Hawaii, right? Not a state. Nobody really knew much about Hawaii on the mainland, and what they did know, they were very, prejudiced, and they really thought that folks there were, semi-savages, or there was no concept of anything about Hawaii, and so they couldn't believe that this could possibly be true, and even to the extent that the national group in New York said, like, what are you using for timepieces, like clocks, like there's no way that that is possibly true. So, right from the get-go, it was an uphill battle to get established. And, I mean, as you pointed out earlier, I mean, now Duke is a legend. And still, his legacy is surfing. It is, he was also called the ambassador of aloha, right? Mm-hmm. So he was sort of the face of Hawaii for many, many, many years. But what I wanted to get to was the kind of the nitty-gritty times when he was having to really battle and find himself and find the right voice, and when faced with prejudice and bigotry, and I felt like a lot of stories about him. It's easy to mythologize people from the past, and especially ones who have had great, feats of sporting success, and I just wanted to know, like, what was he really like? What was the human part of this, when you're facing such obstacles? And so, I think that's certainly at the heart of the book, and I think also I on the flip side, I was sort of in my early proposal about the book, I sort of thought of Johnny Weissmuller as a bit of a, he was a rival, of course, from Chicago, from the mainland. He was half Duke's age, actually, at the time of the Paris Olympics in '24, and so I wouldn't say I was casting him as a villain, but I was sort of like,
I wanted him to be a villain.
Really kind of like a little tension between, and but the more I looked into his past, it was like, and the book is really focused on his pre-Hollywood, pre-Tarzan, as everybody will know him as. It was in his adolescence and his 19s and 20s when he was breaking records, and he too was from a poor background, immigrant parents. His dad walked out the door when he was a young boy, and there was all sorts of racial problems in Chicago in before the Great War, which was when he was an adolescent. German Americans were despised, and you have to put yourself in the shoes of what that must have felt like. How did that color his life? How he, and that was kind of what I was looking for.
And I thought he was a very interesting character. I said I was wanting him to be. I mean, it's impossible to not fall in love with Duke. I mean, it really is impossible when you read him. How can you not? He just seems like, you know, this taciturn but charmer, you know, of a guy who had such talents and was just laid back, right? And you just felt like you wanted him to succeed so badly, you know, all the time.
Kind of regal.
Right. And you know, Weissmuller, you know, in contrast, I think you do a really good job of doing that, like showing like he was coming from a bit of a hard scrabble background, and just a lot of pieces fell into place for him, and especially with this new explosion. And I thought this was there's so many interesting things about your book, but I thought the explosion of the YMCAs, I would not have ever thought that the YMCAs spread across America would have engendered this swimming ability to like across the country, and then even in the world, like because even when we're talking about Japan, just you know that they were able, that organization, to provide you know this possibilities for youngsters to be able to you know move forward through a sport.
When you didn't have the club, you know, you didn't have access to elite clubs and the usual spots, the Ivy League stuff. You really had an access point, you know, as you said, like across the U.S. as it was exploding, but also, you know, across the world where, you know, it was the best way to kind of recruit followers for the YMCA was through sports, and more specifically Olympic sports, which you know, I think the grand plan was always to bring. At that point, it was China, the Philippines, Japan into the fold. You know,
of course.
Of
course, and you know, and like I say, like a lot of times with Johnny, like he was in the right place at the right time, and you had that, you know, you have that one coach who's willing to, you know, grab you, and was a marketer, you know, basically, easy way to say it, who knew what he had, and was ready to, I don't want to say exploit, but kind of exploit.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, for sure, you know, his talents and ability, you know, and it worked, right? It definitely worked, and even with his background, you know, being like a golden boy, you know, does still, you know, get you much further, you know, in a lot of places. And so it's very interesting. So you have these three people, again, like in Hawaii, like Japan, right? Island nations, people spend their time swimming, right? Like swimming is a normal, natural exercise that you're going to be doing. And then you have Chicago, which, I mean, you are on a Great Lake, so, you know, it's not like you're not near water, but still in a city, you know, you're less likely to be found, you know, swimming. And so it was just, say, like a perfect moment in time to get these three real superstars. And like, you know, Duke is aging out, at this point, you know, and then you have Johnny, who's at the top of his game, and then you have, what I'm going to say, Takaish, who's like nobody knows about him, right? Like they're like Japan, you know.
It's very Europe-centric and U.S.-centric, and so there's really no knowledge of what's going on in Japan, you know. So you know, and you know, certain bias and prejudice as well. I mean, at that point, you know, Takaishi was, you know, faced with, in Japan with, you know, these racist and exclusionary laws that were, you know, just introduced in the U.S., and it became the law of the land, you know, that the Japanese were not welcome. Suddenly, you know, several years ago we were, you know, allies, right? So it was shocking to Japan at that point in time. So.
And you know, and you know, people, obviously, immigration's always a hot topic, you know, in our country and in all countries really. But you know, people don't know the history and realize at different points where we were restricting, different peoples to be able to come into the country. And that's just been our history, forever. And it's just where they're coming from has changed, perhaps. But it's not really ever changed that we do restrict who's coming in and where they're coming from. And I guess I didn't know that we had started with Japan so much earlier. Like I knew like around the World War II. Right, that we had a lot of issues with, Japanese and Japanese American citizens, but I didn't realize how early that had started. So to me, it was a really fascinating thing, and I liked that, you have Duke really loving going to Paris because there people aren't looking at him. In this way where he's, a savage, coming from nowhere. And it's like, oh, in Paris, they seem to be a little more enlightened, and they welcome me.
There was a real recognition of his, not just his swimming ability, but his personality, his willingness to be, open and sharing the music of his culture and singing and, So I think that was something that was really received so well in Paris, and I think he won the gold medal he'd done back-to-back gold medals in the 100 meter, both in 1912 and 1920, and it's interesting that. I think it's right now they're swimming in the Seine River in Paris, right? And I'm pretty sure the Duke was the last person to swim in the Seine in a major race, because right after the 1920 Olympics, they did some exhibition swims and he swam in the Seine. And all of Paris showed up. I mean, it was tens of thousands of people on the banks of the river, and he won, of course. But he was gracious, and he was, again, he was beloved for his attitude and his graciousness. But I think that it's pretty stunning that it was so many people came out to the Seine, and you kind of wonder. I don't know what went into the thinking of introducing the Seine as the kind of the center point of the Paris Games right now, but I think they did their check of history, because they understood that this would be a great thing to do, and I think that for Duke. Ever since that time, and his swim in the Seine, I think that he was revered. So when he came back in 1924, even though he was older, and Johnny Weissmuller was probably favored to win, I think there was a lot of people who were hoping that he would turn back time and do something really special.
Yeah, I was hoping so too.
We won't tell anybody, but
No one could look up and find out what happened.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to take a little break so you can read a little bit from your book, and then we'll get back to talking after that.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Okay.
So I'm going to set up this passage that I'm going to read a little bit. It's just to put you in the where it's happening. But right now it's the first chapter. It's Paris. It's July 20th, 1924. The stadium is packed, and the race of the century is about to get underway between Duke Kahanamoku, Johnny Weissmuller, and Katsuo Takaish. And I think just to put a mark on this, this is like the last event of the games in 1924. And the previous weeks had been rife with all sorts of troubles and fights and controversies, but this was suddenly, the stadium had a certain magic to it, and I think that there was calm that was descended sort of on the scene, and it was like a French Nel lens, bending many points of light. From a singular beam so strong and luminous it could cut through the darkness of a stormy sea. All had turned out despite an ongoing heat wave that scorched the city with 100-degree temperatures. On top was the long-awaited 100-meter swimming showdown between Chicago's brash world champion holder Johnny Weissmuller and Hawaii's stoic Duke Kahanamoku, the two-time defending Olympic sprint champ. Competing against each other for the first time ever at the Olympics, the two stood side by side on the edge of the pool deck, the lanes separated by ropes supported with floating cork. Crouched for the start, their arms stretched behind them like airplane wings. Each man was strikingly handsome, their muscles outlined in wool singlets. Coming out of an era when leisure-seeking beach-goers wore full-body swimsuits, Kahanamoku and Weissmuller now looked the way young men ached to look: physical, free, and desirable.
But what happens?
Just a taste.
So, as I say, a great book. Like, I read it, finished it this week, as I said. And just so many really interesting pieces to it. And, readers, when you're getting into the story, right, you have these three very different people coming from three very different backgrounds,
right.
Three different, actually, sort of disciplines, too, as well. Coming together in this big final race, which is, kind of where the book is, the apex point at the end, like you're leading up to this at the end. But I appreciated, I just want to talk about that, after. So the afterwards, right? We have that race. People can read the book or look it up, see how it ended. Tell you what I hoped for, but I'm not going to spoil it. But then you talk about what happened after, right? And the deaths of each of these people, and it's kind of a little bit of a sad story for Johnny, right? In the end, because Duke is still a legend, and he was feted in quite a wonderful manner, upon his death, and Takaish, same, he died sadly younger, but. Same, like he had like a real wonderful send-off, but like poor Johnny, who was probably arguably right the most successful of them all, and with known as Tarzan and all of that stuff, like ended up sort of like sadly having a sort of a sad ending to his life.
And it is sad because, he declined rapidly, and he ended up living in Mexico, which is where he died, and where he's buried. And it was just sort of, to me, it was sort of also poignant in a way because it was so much of his life was searching for, roots with family, which, was, and was a longing that, when contrasted against Duke's, upbringing, his family, Duke had this, litany of brothers and sisters and cousins. I mean, you go to Hawaii and everybody knows Duke, and everybody, knows a family member of Duke's, but Johnny just sort of disappeared, and and I just thought that was. I searched for relatives of his, and I did. He does have a granddaughter who is trying to kind of maybe not. I wouldn't say do what has been done for Duke, but I mean I think she would love to see his story resurrected in a way that was more flattering, and yeah, and I think so. I mean, I think that maybe something different will happen, you know, about his legacy. But I mean, I don't think Johnny wasn't a man of letters. He didn't leave a lot behind. You know, he was just a free-spirited, you know, carefree guy who everybody loved, you know. But when things, you know, when he fell into hard times and, you know, had trouble with alcoholism and you know, it's just like it's not uncommon with the sports, you know, figures for some, you know, for some reason that they don't take care of themselves, and it ends, you know, kind of brutally.
Yeah, that was not to end on such a sad note, but
yeah.
But I mean, I think, you know, this book goes a long way to highlighting, you know, these three superstars that, you know, when we're looking at today and like, you know, what we have today and like the wonderful tapestry of different people who make up the Olympics, and, you know, really what is it, de Coubertin?
Yes.
Yep. Like his dream, right? Kind of thing. Like now we're there, right? Like with what he really wanted the Olympics to be.
Right.
And that's a wonderful thing. But I love that this book is out right now because it's showing where the beginning of this was really starting to happen.
And I think that it does. There's echoes, you know, right now. I mean, you see, the games are never going to be perfect. There's always going to be, you know, protests or cheating or this or that, and yet there's poignancy and brilliance and emotion to all that happens on this stage. And, you know, I think that the 24 games, and I would argue, you know, what happened in this swimming stadium was, you know, where I think they really stole the show. You know, that was really that kick-started the whole momentum of the Olympics to what we see today, which is it's entertaining, it's a show, it's you know, it's hard not to look every moment at what's going on because it's compelling. And I don't think the history of the Olympics was pretty spotty up until 1924, and that's when it really took hold.
Yeah. So great timing for this book.
Yeah, I hope so.
Really so. Well, I have one last question for you,
Sure.
which is, do you have a library card?
I do. Yeah. I do.
As a librarian, it's always very important to me.
Of course I do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank
it was
you for
a real
having me.
pleasure
I really
talking
enjoyed
to
it.
you.
Thank you.
And, you know, good luck with your book. And
Thank you.
to everybody out there, thank you for watching. You can find this book, I'm sure, in your local libraries or bookstores and other places. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you again next time at A Novel Idea.